Okay, so I want to share a third case study with you, and I call it porn addiction, the only part that I can't befriend. Now, I want to let you know that before IFS, I used to do a lot of work in addiction. One of the areas I actually focused on was porn addiction. Back in the day, including therapists, would have a particular way of dealing with addiction, whether that was drugs, pornography, or whatever. And that way was actually kind of shaming. In fact, we used to have something called the hot seat. When I struggled with my drug addiction and alcoholism, I actually personally sat in the hot seat. And I can tell you it was not fun. Man, did I have some shame. In fact, if I didn't have any shame going into that experience, I had some shame coming out of that experience. Right? So needless to say, things have changed over the years, and thank God for IFS. I never did believe in that old approach, so when I discovered how to work with addiction through an IFS lens, it made sense to me. Right? Now, before I get into my client, let me tell you about a study that was done that will help you understand what I'm talking about. Okay, this study looked at how mood affected the immune system. Researchers found that people who experience negative emotions, their immune system improved. Well, obviously that didn't make any sense at all. So they kept studying and they found that they actually had two groups of people who were experiencing negative emotion. Except one group, the immune system improved, and the other group, it went down. It turned out that the group where the immune system did not improve, they all felt that they shouldn't be feeling the negative emotions. And the group where the immune system improved, they all accepted the fact that they were going through something hard and actually saw it as something normal and allowed themselves to feel that emotion, right? Or in IFS, accepted that part, okay? So you see, it is that inner critic, right? That first group that felt they should not be feeling the negative emotions, that was the inner critic, right? That was the part that caused the internal conflict. Right? It's so interesting that no matter what people come to therapy with, whether it's depression, anxiety, addiction, an eating disorder, I found that they all have one thing in common. They all have a part of them that hates themselves because of that. Right? So why am I telling you this story? Because this is what I see in pretty much every single case. There's always a part that is critical, especially with addiction, especially with those firefighters. Oftentimes people are afraid to befriend this part because if they fear that if they do befriend this part, it's going to get worse. But actually the opposite happens. 100% of the time, pretty much the opposite happens. Okay? I can speak from experience. My clients who struggle with pornography, that's usually the case. That they all hate this part. They get it from themselves, from the churches, from society, you name it, right? So the thought of befriending this part is something they can't see themselves doing it first, right? For different reasons, for the reasons I've named, obviously for the fear that it's going to get worse, but the opposite happens. Okay, so let me show you exactly what happens, or what happened with this client, and how we use parts mapping to help the client see what was happening in his system. Okay, so here's what happened. The client experiences a trigger. Once the client experiences a trigger, the trigger activates some type of exile. Okay, the client experiences the feelings of the exile. Let's call it shame. Something vulnerable. So he acts out with a firefighter behavior, right? That's what firefighters do. They come up after the trigger, right? We learned that early on. So he acts out with porn to cover up the shame. Okay, but after the firefighter acts out, another part comes out, the inner critic, who beats him up for doing that. Guess what happens? He feels more shame. The client has to keep doing this over and over again. This is, maybe you remember, this is what some people might call the shame cycle. Or the addiction cycle. But basically, this is what's happening now from an IFS perspective. We can actually look at the different parts involved with this cycle now, right? It's not just pornography. There's other parts involved in this game. Okay, so you can see how the shame cycle keeps you stuck, or it kept the clients stuck, right? So what we did in this case is we started to be curious about what was going on. When the client was aware that they actually had an inner critic part that was doing this and making things worse, we started to be able to practice unblending from that part. Hey, can the inner critic give us some space so we can look at this part, right? So you may have to work a little bit harder because, again, remember, there's certain parts that's a little bit harder to do that with, right? So you may have to work a little bit harder with the inner critic or those other parts that don't want you to go there for those reasons I said earlier, right? But once they do, then we were able to find that this firefighter part has been doing this for so long. This is a very, very, a part that started at a very young age, and how it had to take on this role to protect the system, and how it actually was forced into this role, believe it or not. Okay. Slowly but surely, the client started to have more compassion towards this part of him, and his pornography usage significantly went down. Okay, this was he had never saw his parts this way before, right? It was like a light bulb moment, as you can about imagine. All of a sudden, you have more compassion for a part, and there's no more shame involved. Okay. So you can use that with your client, use this cycle, if you will, to help you map out parts, especially for those parts that's hard to befriend. And you can work towards helping your clients have more compassion. Okay, so that is just about all for this section. I hope it helped to see a few cases on how working with parts and doing parts mapping early on can help you and the client understand their inner world. Okay. Remember, a big part of getting more self-energy is experiencing any of those C's. All right. Oftentimes, doing these exercises can help your client have more clarity, which is a C, which is more self-energy, which is going to prepare them for trauma processing. Okay. There's something about when there's clarity and something resonates with the client, it actually calms the brain down. Oh, there's calm, another C. Right? So you'll see in the module with self-energy how these C's, these qualities build on one another. Okay? But you get the point. Okay? So just a few takeaways from this section. Sometimes clients will not want to call it a part, and that's okay. All right? You can go with it. They might be right. All right? Remain curious and see if you can come up with a way to talk about parts without talking about parts. All right? This is called IFS Informed Talk Therapy. You do what you've been doing, but you have the awareness now of parts. Okay? The second takeaway is parts need outside help. Just like from an Army veteran, parts need outside help, and that's okay. Right? Check out acupuncture, by the way, if you haven't done so already. All right, I learned so much. I can tell you a few stories personally and professionally from about how acupuncture helped with infertility issues, obviously the night terror issues, and there's so much more tools that a client can use outside of therapy to help their parts. Okay. I always tell people the first step is to acknowledge these parts. When we acknowledge these parts, everything else is gained, whether it's medication, acupuncture, whatever, right? With my Army guy, we welcomed the parts, right? We saw them, we acknowledged them, they told us what they needed, okay? A third big takeaway is, remember, most people have an inner critic, right? I think we all do to some degree, right? And when we ask a client how they feel towards a part and they say they don't like it, that's another part. right? So oftentimes this inner critic will cause the person to get and stay stuck in their shame, right? So you use mapping, map out these cycles to get a better picture of things, okay? I will give you more examples on how to do that when we look at the tools and parts mapping tools that you can use, all right? And also, when in doubt, right, and you don't know what to do, hear me very clearly right here, okay? You're good. You're in sessions. You get stuck. You don't know what to do. You get lost. Do this, all right? The way back to self energy is through curiosity, okay? It's a way to get back to self and to get you back on track. If you get stuck, remember that if you're a consultant and you're watching this and your consultees come to you with these questions about, hey, I feel stuck, whether you feel stuck as a consultant or you're trying to help your consultee, the way back to self energy is through curiosity. Just get curious, and for the most part, um, your system will take you where you need to go. Okay. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson, this section, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.